The rain showed no sign of letting up that night, transforming the old road between Sheffield and Leeds into a corridor of shadows and distorted reflections. The taxi's headlights cut through the darkness, but they seemed incapable of fully illuminating the path ahead, as if the night itself conspired to hide its secrets. Behind the wheel, Ethan gripped the steering wheel tightly, his fingers pale like the overcast sky outside. He was tired, but there was no stopping. The radio, always tuned to local stations, crackled with constant interference, emitting fragments of disconnected voices. Sometimes they sounded like normal conversations, other times a low murmur that made his hair stand on end. He pushed the thought away with a sigh, convinced it was just static, but something about that road seemed wrong. The air was heavy, laden with a strange metallic smell that seeped in through the car's ventilation. Ethan had a secret, one he carried like an invisible weight. That's why he drove at night, trying to avoid the judging eyes of people and perhaps his own conscience. His mind wandered, but it was pulled back by the sight of something ahead. A motionless figure by the side of the road, a tall, thin man with a black overcoat that shimmered in the rain. He raised his hand in a slow gesture, asking for a ride. Hesitantly, Ethan slowed down. Something about that man's gaze, even from a distance, deeply unsettled him, but he had already stopped. The door opened with a strange click, and the passenger entered without saying a word. Only the sound of low breathing and the echo of the closing door filled the uncomfortable silence. The journey, he realized, was just beginning. The silence inside the taxi was almost unbearable. Ethan looked in the rear-view mirror, trying to study the passenger's face, but the dim light of the dashboard didn't reach his features. The man sat motionless, like a statue. The only visible thing was the outline of a wide-brimmed hat and the fleeting reflection of eyes gleaming in the darkness. "Where are we going?" Ethan finally broke the silence, his voice more tremulous than he would have liked. The response came as a drawn-out whisper, almost swallowed by the sound of the rain. "Keep going." A chill ran down his spine. Something about the tone of that voice seemed wrong, not just low, but distorted, as if two people were speaking at the same time. He swallowed hard and tried to focus on the road. The rain continued to batter the windscreen, and the wipers could barely keep up. The radio started emitting static again, but this time it seemed different. Ethan swore he could hear fragments of words in the noise, voices whispering something incomprehensible. He tried to turn it off, but the button seemed unresponsive. The interference grew louder, filling the car with a sound that made his ears ache. "Is everything all right?" he asked, casting a nervous glance in the mirror. The man did not respond, but Ethan noticed something disturbing. The passenger's reflection seemed wrong. He blinked several times, trying to shake off the fatigue. But no matter how many times he looked, the reflection in the rear-view mirror seemed to move at a different rhythm from the body in the back seat. Suddenly, a strong metallic smell filled the car, the same one he had smelled before. Blood. Nausea rose in his throat, but he had no time to react. A dull thud, like a punch on the car's body, echoed through the vehicle. He looked around, searching for the source, but saw nothing but the darkness of the road. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice faltering. "Keep driving," the man replied, his voice cold and empty. The feeling that something was terribly wrong became inescapable. When Ethan looked in the rearview mirror again, he realized the back seat was empty. The passenger had disappeared, but the smell and the feeling of being watched remained, as if something invisible was still there, waiting. Ethan pulled the car over to the side of the road, his hands trembling as he turned off the engine. The rain drummed on the roof, muffling the sounds from outside. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. The back seat was empty, but the air inside the car seemed heavier, almost suffocating. The metallic smell persisted, clinging to his throat. "I'm imagining things," he murmured to himself. although the certainty in his words was far from true. With forced courage, he turned to the back seat. Nothing. No trace of the man, no mark of water that should have dripped from his soaked coat. It was as if the passenger had never been there, but something in the darkness seemed to be watching him, like an invisible presence. He started the engine again, determined to get out of there as quickly as possible. But when he put the car in motion, he realized something had changed. The road, once familiar, now seemed to stretch endlessly. The streetlights, spaced at regular intervals, were now off, leaving only the taxi's headlights to cut through the darkness. The GPS on his dashboard flickered uncontrollably, switching between error screens and an impossible location. Nowhere. Panic grew in Ethan. The landscape around him became blurred, with trees that seemed to move subtly at the edge of the road, as if they were alive. The rain, previously constant, now fell in an irregular rhythm, as if manipulated by something beyond nature. Then he saw it. A figure ahead, right in the middle of the road, illuminated by the headlights. It was the same man in the black overcoat. Ethan braked sharply, the tires skidding on the wet asphalt. The car stopped a few meters from the stranger. With his heart pounding in his chest, Ethan watched him. The man did not move, just stood there, as if waiting for something. Before Ethan could react, the taxi's lights flickered, and the man disappeared, as if he had never been there. But a low, guttural sound came from somewhere around him, reverberating through the car's cabin. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes wide as he tried to understand what was happening. He felt something behind him, a presence that made every hair on his body stand on end. The rearview mirror showed only darkness, but he knew he was not alone. A deep, almost inaudible voice whispered in his ear, "You cannot escape." The taxi was motionless in the middle of the deserted road, with Ethan trapped between the desperate desire to flee and the paralyzing fear of the unknown. The voice he had heard seemed to echo in his mind, reverberating like a distant drum. He looked around, but there was nothing but the torrential rain and the darkness. It was as if the whole world had disappeared, leaving only him and that oppressive void. Suddenly, the radio came back to life, hissing in an irregular tone before emitting disconnected words. "Guilt. Never. They are waiting for you." The voice seemed familiar, but distorted, as if filtered through a nightmare. Ethan tried to turn it off again, but the button wouldn't work, stuck in an endless cycle of interference. "This isn't real. This isn't real!" he shouted, the sound of his own voice weak and useless in the confined space of the car. But then, the impossible happened. The landscape around him began to change, like a distorted mirage on a broken screen. The trees, once lined along the road, became twisted and grotesque, as if made of flesh instead of wood. The road, which had seemed endless, now split into multiple paths, each leading to an even more terrifying void. Ethan felt the steering wheel vibrate in his hands, as if the car itself was reacting to the environment. And then he saw them, human figures emerging from the rain, their outlines blurred, but with eyes that shone intensely like headlights from another world. They walked slowly towards the taxi, surrounding it like predators observing prey. Their faces were blurred, but their forms conveyed a palpable, almost unbearable pain. Ethan knew, deep down, who these people were. He tried to accelerate, but the car wouldn't move. The figures began to knock on the windows with bloody hands, leaving marks that glowed with a strange light. The radio static intensified, accompanied by anguished screams that seemed to come from all sides. Then, amidst the chaos, a familiar voice stood out. "Why did you abandon us, Ethan?" His heart froze. It was the voice of his wife, Clara, a memory he had spent years trying to bury. He saw her among the figures, her face partially visible, but marked by pain and accusation. Her words hit him like sharp blades. "You left us that night. You could have saved us." Ethan screamed, tears streaming down his face. He knew what she was talking about, the accident he had caused years ago when he was driving drunk and lost control. Clara and his son were with him, but he was the only one to survive. Since then, he had lived in flight, driving night after night, trying to escape his guilt. The figures around the car began to pull him out. Their cold, sticky hands grabbed his arms, dragging him onto the road. He tried to fight, but it was like fighting against a whirlwind of shadows. He fell to his knees on the wet asphalt, surrounded by the souls of those he had lost, Clara, his son, and the other victims of that tragic accident. "I'm sorry," Ethan shouted, his voice tearing through the silence. I didn't want this to happen." The figures stopped, their forms trembling like flames in the wind. Clara approached him, her eyes shining with an intensity that seemed to pierce his soul. "You can't run forever, Ethan. This is the end of the road for you." Suddenly the road crumbled beneath his feet. He felt himself falling into an endless abyss, swallowed by a darkness that seemed alive. Screams echoed around him, his own memories mixing with distorted images of faces and places, and then everything fell silent. Ethan woke up with a start, gasping and drenched in sweat. The metallic smell had disappeared, replaced by the fresh air of the morning that was beginning to dawn. He was in the same taxi, parked by the side of the road, but the landscape around him was different. There was no more rain, darkness, or that oppressive feeling of being watched. The old road between Sheffield and Leeds now seemed ordinary, almost peaceful. For a moment, he believed that it had all been just a nightmare. But as he adjusted the rearview mirror, he saw something that made his heart stop again. On the back seat, a small object shimmered in the morning light. It was an old photograph, yellowed at the edges, showing him, Clara, and their son laughing together in a park. He knew that this photo had been lost in the accident. It shouldn't exist. Tears began to fall before he could stop them. He picked up the photograph with trembling hands and held it against his chest, feeling a mix of relief and pain. Clara's words still echoed in his mind. "You can't run forever." Ethan looked at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to rise, tinting the sky with shades of orange and pink. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the urge to drive away. Something inside him had changed. He knew he still carried the weight of guilt, but now he also understood that he couldn't keep running. He needed to face what he had done, accept his choices, and perhaps find a path to redemption. When he started the car, something caught his attention on the dashboard. The GPS, which previously displayed the word "nowhere," now showed a single coordinate. He hesitated, but an inexplicable feeling made him follow the indicated destination. The road seemed familiar, but in a way he couldn't explain. Upon arriving at the location, he found a small abandoned chapel, hidden among trees that swayed gently in the wind. There was a strange tranquility about the place, as if time had stopped there. Ethan entered, feeling guided by a higher force. On the altar, a lit candelabra illuminated a plaque with words that seemed made for him. "Forgiveness begins when you forgive yourself." Tears fell again, but this time they were not of despair. Ethan knelt, holding the photo tightly, and for the first time since the accident he prayed, not for absolution, but for the strength to move forward and honor those he had lost. Months had passed since that night on the road, but for Ethan, it seemed like the events were still etched in his mind, like a film that wouldn't stop playing. He had sold the taxi and left behind the life of a night driver. He no longer drove the deserted roads in search of distraction or escape. Instead, he had found an unexpected purpose. The chapel he had discovered at dawn had become his refuge. He dedicated weeks to its restoration, cleaning every corner, replacing windows, and fixing the altar. There was no congregation there, just him. But something about that place seemed to connect him to a peace he had never imagined finding. The days passed slowly, but each nail placed, each wall painted, was like another brick in the reconstruction of his own soul. One afternoon, while organizing the small prayer space, Ethan found a diary hidden under the altar. The pages were stained by time, but the writings were still legible. It was an account of a man who had lived there many years before, a priest who helped lost travelers on the road. The final pages, however, spoke of strange apparitions and souls that wandered among the living, trapped by the weight of their guilt. Ethan felt a chill as he read, recognizing the descriptions of the figures that had haunted him that night. The final words of the diary, however, seemed like a warning. Those who face their ghosts may find the light. Those who deny will be lost forever in the darkness. The next day, Ethan placed a sign outside the chapel with a simple inscription, "Refuge for the Lost." He didn't know who would come, but he felt that this place had a mission, just like he did. A week later, at dusk on a rainy afternoon, a car stopped on the road near the chapel. A woman got out, her eyes tired and her expression one of deep sadness. Ethan watched her from a distance, remembering himself in that same situation. He greeted her with a gentle smile, offering shelter and a word of comfort. As the woman entered the chapel, Ethan felt that familiar presence again, but this time it was not frightening. He looked up at the sky and murmured a silent thanks. The souls that had guided him on that road were no longer lost, neither was he. And so, the road between Sheffield and Leeds gained a new destination. It was no longer just a path to nowhere, but a meeting point for those seeking to find themselves again.